Hey guys, it's Sign here with Hobbies and Man once again, and today we're doing another book review. Today we're looking at a novella collection called Our Own Way by Misty Vixen. This is the original version that you can get for free on her website. I'll leave a link to it down below. And this novella collection has recently been taken down from Amazon and replaced with a new version, which is actual like full-length novels. And I think there's 4 out of planned 9 out so far, already. And this version that I'm reviewing right now is not like the true version. It's like the original version, if that makes sense. This is self-published. It was on Amazon before. I bought them when she had finished writing them. I think they were like 99 cents a piece, which is a bit much for a novella, but that's like the lowest price that you can get anything on Amazon for. So it's understandable that that's what they cost. You can get this version of it for free. On her website, like I said. The demographic is adult, and the genres here are slice of life, men's romance, and kind of just like drama, I guess. I'm not really sure, because it's not really a dramatic series, at least not broadly, only kind of in the beginning and in some specific moments. It's broadly more of a slice of life, kind of easygoing, romantic type of story, right? And it does not have an adaptation. It does have a new edition. This would be an interesting like soap opera, I guess, or maybe like a sitcom type thing, but it might be something that can only really happen for like a season or two. This might be something more in line with like an anime. That might be probably the best way to make this possible. But since it has such like elevated content, I'm not sure that it would really pass, because I think even stuff like Invincible doesn't really get into like proper, adult content, right? So it is what it is. And ratings wise, is a 4 out of 5 for me. I really enjoyed it. It was a nice weekend read that I blew through 2 weekends ago. 3, I guess, by the time this comes out. And it was pretty fun. I had a lot of enjoyment come out of this, but it's not necessarily the best written thing, and I think that's why she has since rewritten it and re-uploaded it as a new edition, right? So the premise here is that there's this character, Gabe, who kind of has a rough life, and he's not very good at socializing or saying no. He's kind of a guy that's down on his luck, but finally has managed to change that around and has moved out to live independently in his own home. At the same time, as he's kind of settling down, he realizes that he has no one. And a woman from his past who was oddly placed into his life, basically, barrels back into it and changes his outlook on life, his desires for life, and his interest in life by introducing him to a bevy of babes, I guess is the easiest way to say this. So it's a really wild premise, but it's very enjoyable. Misty Vixen doesn't necessarily play realistic, but she plays it as realistic as something like this can be. It doesn't feel super contrived anywhere, although of course you understand that it is. It's just like the way in which it works is natural enough to feel possible, even if it's not necessarily realistic, if that makes sense. I think that's the best way to describe this. So the plot line here opens up with what I just described as a premise. Gabe is 26 years old. He's a small-time author. He has recently started writing erotica and has seen some success, enough that with a very generous landlady, which is probably the most unrealistic thing out of all of this, has managed to get himself a small little home he can rent. And as he's finishing his move-in, he realizes that he's alone, that he has no one he can share his space with, no one that he can share his life with. And as he's coming to this realization, he gets a phone call. And this phone call turns out to be from this woman called Ellen, who is an older lady that he knew from his time working at a grocery store, like a small mom and pop type grocery store in his small town. She comes back into his life, and she explains to him, hey, I just broke up with my fiance. I don't have anywhere to go. You're the only person that I can think of. Can I come stay with you? And, it kind of works out for him. He says, yeah, sure. And as this happens, Gabe lets her into his life in this very specific moment. And she basically just never leaves after that, right? So this reintroduction into each other's lives has kindled this flame of interest and love in between them. They have a consummation of their relationship quite quickly, and ultimately they get together into a very nice, very comforting, relationship, right? And as this happens, Ellen realizes that she finally feels free enough to really express herself in the ways that she wants, and this includes having an open relationship with Gabe, where they bring in other female characters, which is, maybe a bit unrealistic as well, but in the internet and in modern life, it's really possible to find all sorts of people, all sorts of things. And so this isn't really that crazy. And given that it's like a men's romance type story, a haremlit type story, it makes sense that they would be something like this. So she starts flirting with some of the women that are in their area. She deals with her ex and finally properly moves in with Gabe. And then she reconnects with her old friend, whose name is, Crystal, I think, and she starts, exchanging racy texts with her, and this kind of introduces her into their circle of characters that they're interacting with, right? They go to a cafe, they pick up one of the waitresses, they're called Holly, and she falls in with their relationship. She becomes their third person in the relationship. They kind of become a throuple, if that makes sense. And this slowly builds up into a larger relationship, right? They realize that she needs a lot of love, Gabe needs control, and Ellen needs freedom, and so they find a way to make that work for them in their little house, right? There's this side plot where the landlady ends up being a cougar, and he wants to sleep with her. They introduce an old coworker of Gabe's that is in and out of their relationship quite quickly. She's kind of more of a one-and-done type character. Holly moves in, Sadie accepts this move-in, and then there's this slow burn between a bunch of characters as they develop their life together, right? So basically it all revolves around the fact that these characters are all people that want to be creative and different and kind of not really deal with the scope of normal life, right? They don't want to be part of the workforce in the traditional sense. They want to find ways to make money that is based around their creativity, right? And, I think this is a very realistic aspect of this story. This is an understandable kind of reality of humanity that most of us at least, don't really want to be wage slaves or workers, but we realize that we have to, right? And so since not all of us can climb the corporate ladder far enough that we don't really have to work as much as everyone else, we have to find our own way, right? Which is where the title of the book comes from. And so using Gabe's writing as kind of the main situation around which their money making revolves around, Ellen becomes a website designer, Holly becomes a photographer, or I said that wrong, a photographer, and Gabe is the character through which they can use all of their skills to make money, right? And then this introduces a few other characters along the way. Crystal shows up in person at some point. They have this wild week where they kind of really introduce everything into the mix. There is substance abuse that's introduced here, mostly weed, right? Which is something that I'm not interested in. I know it's kind of weird for someone my age to be against it in some way, but it's just not something I appreciate. And I did find this to be a little bit annoying on my end. I was like, oh, I don't like that this is a part of the way these characters connect, right? It should not really be like that. I mean, most people don't connect over smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol, right? That's kind of an aspect of social interaction, but it's not really the main crux through which characters connect. And maybe that's just the reality of those being more established, kind of older people type things, and weed is a much more kind of a social interaction. I'm not really sure, but I didn't really like that aspect. I didn't think it's bad per se. I probably don't care, but I didn't enjoy that was the crux through which these characters connected, if that makes sense. And then she goes away to go get her girlfriend, and they bring her back. We get introduced to this other character who's a pregnant lady for the fetish, plot point there. And then we finally finish up the story here with Sadie, with the landlady. It all works out pretty well. They all head home. And eventually Sadie's like, you know what? I have a bigger house that you guys can rent. I'm just happy that I have money and that I have these properties, and I'm willing to give them to you guys since we are kind of this weird, family in some sense, right? And so they all move into that house, and that's kind of where the story wraps up. And it was pretty enjoyable. I liked it. It was a nice way to spend a weekend. It wasn't like the best written ever, it wasn't like an amazing story, but it was enjoyable. There was some really honest and realistic kind of aspects to each of these characters in some way or fashion, right? Holly is a young, kind of depressed girl who has a rough time with her mother. Ellen is a woman that is highly successful, but realizes that that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to be loved by certain people, and mostly by the people that she expects to be with, or is expected by society to be with. Gabe is someone that, has no love in his life. His parents didn't really care for him. He had to kind of figure out how to live by himself, and that's kind of a very, well understood kind of male issue, if that makes sense. And you have other characters like that, right? Sadie had a difficult kind of abusive relationship, or maybe a neglectful relationship is probably more in line with what it should be described as. And so all of these characters find healing and love and appreciation through their very weird swinger, poly, whatever you want to call it, relationship. And so I found that enjoyable and interesting. I like how that developed, but it is not necessarily the best written stuff. I do want to read the new version, see how it compares. I think that by this point, Misty Vixen is a much better writer, and her stories are longer, so it should be much more natural feeling, right? Because even though this was pretty good, there was a certain element of contrivance to it that was noticeable enough, even with all of the attempts Misty did to try to minimize it, right? So yeah, it is what it is. In terms of characters, we have Gabe, Ellen, Holly, Crystal, Liz, Tiffany, Lily, Sadie, and those are all kind of the women that are involved with Gabe in some way. There are a few other characters that are not involved with Gabe and are kind of antagonistic, but they're not really that important, so I'm not going to mention them at all. So I guess the important thing here is to highlight their ages. So Gabe is 26, Ellen is 34, Holly is 22, Crystal is the same age as Ellen. Liz is unknown, but I assume she's in her late 20s, 29, 32, something like that. Tiffany was in her 20s, unclear though. Lily was as well. She was a streamer. And, if there were changes to the new version, I would actually like Lily, the pregnant lady, to actually be a much more relevant character, because I found her story to make more sense than some of the other ones. And in the sense that she is kind of like a more modern type of creative, right? She's a streamer, if that makes sense. And Sadie was a 55-year-old cougar lady, the landlord. In terms of world building, there was none, because this is like a realistic story. I guess there are some in the sense that because you can't use like Amazon or real life companies, there were some companies that were kind of stand-in companies. So there was this one called like Inferno or Indigo or something like that. Ignition, I think is what it was actually, which was like the equivalent of Amazon and stuff like that, but nothing too crazy here. In terms of artwork and fan service, the artwork is basically just the covers. They're fine, but it's not really amazing work, especially the old covers. The new covers are much better. They're kind of painted and painterly looking, but they're not really amazing. That's kind of the one thing that I think Misty Vixen kind of fails at, is that her writing is quite good, but her covers are not really appealing. Although I do appreciate the fact that she doesn't use AI art at all, or at least none that I've seen so far. And I think that's actually really admirable, because a lot of people in this genre and in the self-published space are using AI covers. And it's really shitty, because all of these people are trying their hardest, and they constantly talk about the fact that they're trying to become artists and make money off of their art and kind of find a way to live off of it. And they're also stealing art themselves, right? And so I find it to be really shitty and kind of hypocritical. And so I appreciate that Misty has not done that. But the end result is that her covers don't look as appealing as some of the other ones in the market, which is, kind of difficult for her, right? So yeah, otherwise, in terms of the fan service, it's mostly smutty. I mean, most of the novel is smutty. It's pretty well written. There are some issues, though. There's certain phrases that are, present in the smut and outside of the smut that are just repeated a bit too often, which, usually would not be noticeable if you read these, kind of spread out across a few months. But since I read them all in one go, it felt like I was hearing the same thing over and over again. And so I don't necessarily appreciate that, but it's a very minimal issue, if that makes sense. So ratings wise, a 4 out of 5. I think that the story wraps up a bit too abruptly. There's certain characters that I wanted more from that we didn't really get to see. So I would have liked to see Tiffany return at some point. And I think that the Lily story is a bit more meaningful than some of the other characters, right? Like Liz ends up being kind of like an extra character that's tagged on because she comes with Crystal as a package deal, where I don't necessarily think that Gabe's interest in Liz makes too much sense, whereas I like the Lily character a bit more. So I would have liked that to be a character that we saw more of compared to Liz. I didn't like that character that much. But otherwise, the other thing that I was kind of thinking about is that maybe this was written during the pandemic, more or less, where it's also the time, as far as I remember, when OnlyFans was really growing, right? And so all of these characters are constantly recording themselves having sex and all of this stuff, and they never think, oh, we should make money doing OnlyFans, which seems like a very natural like progression to what they were doing, because they were all kind of creative. They all had websites. They were developing this stuff. They already worked in erotica to an extent, and they even used themselves as models for Gabe's covers. So I feel like, you know, just making an OnlyFans that included all of these characters would have made more sense. And maybe that is something that Misty Vixen might work into the new version, or maybe into a separate story. But I think that's kind of an issue with like thinking of like a modern interpretation of like what she was writing, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. That was the only issue that I had, where it was like, oh, these characters are already doing all of these things. Logically, the next step, which would probably make them a lot of money, would be to do the OnlyFans thing, and then they didn't. So it was kind of weird, but I don't know. Maybe that is a plot point in the new version, right? So there you go. Those are my thoughts on Our Own Way. Like I said, 4 out of 5 was nearly perfect for what it is, which is a novella story from an artist that is a self-published artist that probably doesn't have that much experience. I can't remember how this compares to her other stories, like when they came out and stuff. So, you know, I quite liked it for what it was, but it's not necessarily, you know, up there with like, I don't know, what's like a comparable kind of thing. Like this is definitely better than 50 Shades of Grey or something like that, but maybe it's not like at the same level as like, you know, Anne Rice writing or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. That was a weird, you know, comparison, but I can't really think of anything else. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Our Own Way. Let me know what you think down below. Have you read this? Will you read it? Let me know what you think. Thank you guys very much for watching, and see you guys later.